Norman Rockwell once said he loved painting the seasons winter, spring, and summer, but summer was always his favorite. His paintings showed warm, happy families, cheerful children, and peaceful American life. But behind those bright smiles and gentle scenes, Rockwell carried a secret that few people ever saw. In 1964, he created a painting that shocked the nation. It was so powerful and painful that it made grown men cry and parents cover their children's eyes. The painting showed a truth about America that many didn't want to face. Gallery owners refused to display it, and newspapers wouldn't print it. But Rockwell didn't stop. He painted it anyway, knowing it might destroy his career. That painting revealed the real Norman Rockwell, the man behind the perfection, the man who used art to tell the truth even when it hurt. Norman Rockwell was born on February 3, 1894, in Harlem, New York City. His home was at 789 St. Nicholas Avenue. His parents, Jarvis and Nancy Rockwell, worked hard to give their two sons a decent life. His father worked for a textile company in Philadelphia and stayed there his whole life. They didn't have much money, but they made it work. Norman had an older brother named Jarvis, but they were never very close. Their household was mixed in faith. His father was Presbyterian and his mother was Episcopalian, so things sometimes felt a little divided. The Rockwell family had deep roots in America. Their ancestor, John Rockwell, came from England to America in 1635 on a ship called the Hopewell and helped settle in Connecticut. Even when Norman was just a small boy, people could tell he was different. At only 3 years old, he would sit quietly as his father read aloud the works of Charles Dickens. Norman loved the stories, but even more, he loved the way Dickens painted people with words. His father liked to copy drawings from books, and Norman would watch in fascination. Something awakened in him during those moments, a spark that told him he wanted to create. His mother's father had been a painter too, though he never made much money. He mostly painted landscapes, but the artistic spirit had clearly passed down through generations. Their home was small, filled with love, art, and quiet struggles, and those early experiences shaped Norman in ways he never forgot. By the time he was 9 years old, Norman already felt like he didn't belong. He was skinny, awkward, and often clumsy. At school, he didn't fit in. He wasn't close to his parents either. Drawing became his escape, his way of understanding the world and finding peace. He spent hours sketching alone, creating little characters that reflected how he felt inside. Over time, he learned to use humor in his drawings, exaggerating people's faces and expressions to make them more alive. That same year, his family left the busy streets of New York and moved to a small town called Mamaroneck in Westchester County. The change was huge. Instead of noisy streets and crowded buildings, Norman found quiet roads, open skies, and friendly neighbors. He began to love the simple charm of small-town life. That feeling would later define his art. In Mamaroneck, Norman discovered the work of a famous illustrator named Howard Pyle. He became obsessed with Pyle's drawings and started saving every penny to buy art supplies. Even though his family didn't have much money, Norman's mother encouraged him to follow his dream, though she still kept a very strict and religious household. Norman spent his days watching people, how they smiled, how they moved, how they showed emotions, and he filled his sketchbook with those details. This habit of observing ordinary life would become the foundation of his greatest paintings. By 1908, when Norman was just 14, he made a life-changing decision. He left high school and enrolled in the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art in New York City. Every day, he took the train back and forth from Mamaroneck to the city. His family couldn't afford much, but they supported him as best as they could. At Chase, Norman studied life drawing and even took classes with live nude models, a surprising and awkward experience for a boy raised in a strict home. But he didn't give up. He stayed focused, determined to improve. 2 years later, in 1910, Norman transferred to the National Academy of Design, and then later to the Art Students League of New York. There he studied under some of the best teachers of the time, including Thomas Fogarty, George Bridgman, and Frank Dumond. Each teacher gave him something different. Fogarty taught him how to tell stories with pictures, and Bridgman taught him how to draw the human body with incredible accuracy. It was during this time that Norman realized he wasn't meant to be a traditional fine artist. His gift was illustration. He wanted to tell stories that ordinary people could understand and feel. He wanted his art to speak to the heart. In 1912, when Norman was just 18 years old, he got his first big job. His teacher, Fogarty, helped him get a commission to illustrate a series of stories called Tell Me Why by Carl Claudy. He earned $150 for the job, which was a huge amount for him at the time. But more than the money, it was a turning point in his life. His drawings caught the attention of Edward Cave, the man who was building Boys' Life magazine, the official publication of the Boy Scouts of America. When Norman walked into Cave's office, full of hope, he didn't expect much. But Cave saw something special in him and gave him a chance. Norman began drawing scenes for a camping guide and soon went on to create over 400 illustrations for the magazine. His drawings were so realistic and full of warmth that they captured the spirit of the Boy Scouts perfectly. At that time, Norman was still a tall, skinny young man, 6 feet tall but weighing only about 140 pounds. When World War I came around, he tried to join the Navy, but they rejected him for being underweight. Still, that didn't stop him. His career as an artist had already begun to take off. By 1913, at just 19 years old, Norman became the full-time art editor of Boys' Life. It was an incredible achievement for someone so young. He worked tirelessly, creating hundreds of images that helped shape how Americans saw the Boy Scouts. His art was so popular that the Boy Scout calendars became the best-selling calendars in the country by 1929. Despite his early success, Norman didn't let fame make him proud or careless. He stayed humble and worked harder than ever. In 1914, he became close friends with another artist, Clyde Forsyth. They both worked for Boys' Life and shared a studio in an old barn that once belonged to the legendary Western artist Frederick Remington. Norman considered it a magical place, filled with inspiration. Clyde encouraged him to take a big risk, submit his art to the Saturday Evening Post, the most popular magazine in America at the time. Norman was nervous, but with Clyde's encouragement, he did it. In 1916, when Norman was 22, he finally got his chance. His first cover for the Saturday Evening Post appeared in May of that year, and it was an instant success. Within just a few months, he had painted 6 covers for the magazine. His work stood out for its warmth, humor, and humanity. Life magazine even ran ads calling the Saturday Evening Post the greatest show window in America, and Norman's art was front and center. But while fame came quickly, it also brought pressure. By age 25, Norman had already created 25 covers for the Post, and he left Boys' Life to focus on his growing career. Yet inside, he struggled with doubt. He often felt unsure of himself. He once admitted, "All I had was the ability to draw, which, as far as I could see, didn't count for much." But instead of giving up, he poured those feelings into his art. He painted people who were awkward, shy, and overlooked because that's how he often felt. And by doing so, he made millions of Americans feel understood. That same year, 1916, Norman married Irene O'Connor, a schoolteacher 3 years older than him. They had met briefly at a boarding house in New Rochelle, and soon after, he proposed. But from the beginning, their marriage felt uneasy. Irene wanted a simple home life, while Norman's world revolved around painting. He often disappeared into his studio for hours, forgetting everything else. They never had children, and after some years, Norman admitted that he realized she didn't truly love him. Their marriage lasted 14 years before ending in divorce in 1930. Even while his personal life was falling apart, Norman's career kept growing. He continued painting covers for the Saturday Evening Post, capturing the heart of America through his art. But the pressure never left him. He often felt anxious and afraid that people would forget him. Around 1920, his work became more polished and mature, earning respect from other serious artists. But eventually, the pressure led to exhaustion. Norman suffered what was called a nervous breakdown and had to take a break from work. During this difficult time, he became close friends with the illustrator J.C. Leyendecker, one of his idols. That friendship helped him recover and regain his confidence. As the 1920s went on, Norman's art began appearing in advertisements for big brands like Jell-O, where he painted cheerful family scenes that became his trademark. By 1929, however, his personal life was once again in turmoil. His marriage with Irene had grown cold. They took separate vacations, and when Norman returned from a trip to Europe, she told him she had fallen in love with someone else. The divorce broke his heart, even though he had also been distant and flirtatious during their marriage. In 1930, Norman moved to California, where he stayed with his friend Clyde Forsyth. There, he met Mary Barstow, a young math teacher and aspiring writer. They fell in love quickly and married in her parents' garden on April 17, 1930. Together, they had 3 sons, Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter. But even then, Norman continued to struggle with his mental health. By 1933, he was hospitalized for nervous exhaustion. To the world, he was the most beloved artist in America, but behind closed doors, he was battling deep sadness and self-doubt. Hoping for a fresh start, he took his family to Europe that same year. In Paris, he spent time studying the works of great masters like Rembrandt. But instead of feeling inspired, the trip left him more lost and depressed than before. The cheerful artist of America's small towns was fighting a darkness no one could see. Norman Rockwell began to see himself as a fraud. He believed that his famous Saturday Evening Post covers were nothing compared to the masterpieces hanging in art museums. These thoughts slowly consumed him, and darkness started to take over his mind. He began to wonder if his life had any real meaning, and at his lowest point, he even thought about ending it all. That deep emotional struggle left a scar on his spirit that never fully healed. In 1935, a new chance appeared when he was asked to illustrate Mark Twain's classics The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. At first, he didn't want to take the job, but eventually he agreed. To prepare, he traveled to Hannibal, Missouri, the real hometown of Mark Twain. There, he took many reference photos of the town and its people, something unusual for painters at the time. The illustrations were published in 1936 and 1940, and people loved them. But later, Rockwell felt uncomfortable when he looked back at those drawings. Some of them contained subtle racial stereotypes, a reflection of the era he lived in. As the civil rights movement grew stronger, Rockwell admitted he regretted how he had portrayed certain characters. By 1938, Norman and his wife Mary bought a 60-acre farmhouse in Arlington, Vermont, hoping for a quiet and peaceful life for their family. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. They joined in on local dances and community meetings, appearing happy to everyone around them. But behind those cheerful smiles, their home life was slowly falling apart. Mary had begun drinking heavily, and her alcoholism was destroying their relationship. Rockwell wrote in his private journal about how distant and angry she became whenever she drank. He couldn't even enjoy simple things anymore, like swimming in the river on their property. He told people the water was too cold, but the truth was that anxiety and sadness never left his mind. In 1939, Rockwell began therapy with Erik Erikson, a respected psychoanalyst who had fled Nazi Germany. Erikson helped Rockwell understand that the happy families and warm scenes in his paintings were his way of healing from his lonely childhood. His mother had been emotionally cold and distant, and he had grown up in New York feeling unwanted and alone. Through therapy, he realized that he painted what he wished his life had been, a world full of warmth, family, and love. This understanding gave his work deeper meaning and helped him keep painting with purpose. Then came 1942, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech about 4 essential freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Rockwell decided to turn those ideals into 4 paintings. When he showed the idea to the editors of the Saturday Evening Post, they weren't impressed and worried the theme might upset readers. But Rockwell believed in the message so deeply that he funded the entire project himself. He used his Vermont neighbors as models and spent months creating the pieces. When they were completed, the paintings went on tour in 1943, visiting 16 cities and raising an incredible $132 million in war bonds, worth more than $2 billion today. Over 1 million people came to see them, and Rockwell personally signed prints for fans. However, not everyone approved of his work. Some Americans were angry about the freedom of worship painting because it showed people of different races and religions praying together. Rockwell received hate mail accusing him of promoting racial mixing and communist ideas. Some cities in the South even refused to display the artwork. But despite the backlash, the tour was an enormous success and proved how powerful his art could be. Later that same year, tragedy struck when Rockwell's studio burned down in a fire. He lost everything: hundreds of paintings, costumes, props, and his favorite personal items. The total damage was worth around $100,000 then, or over $1.5 million today. No one ever discovered the exact cause, though some thought his smoking pipe ashes had started it, while others believed it might have been arson after he argued with a neighbor. Whatever the cause, the fire devastated him. His community showed their support by gifting him new pipes, a small act of kindness that touched him deeply. That year, he also created the famous painting Rosie the Riveter for the Saturday Evening Post. The image showed a strong, confident woman crushing Hitler's book under her foot, symbolizing female strength during wartime. Rosie was based on a young telephone operator named Mary Louise Doyle, but Rockwell made her look much larger and more muscular than the real-life model. Although the painting became iconic, many male readers complained. They called it unnatural and cancelled their magazine subscriptions, upset at the idea of women doing men's work. But Rockwell's art had already changed the image of the American hero forever. Behind his success, however, his personal life was collapsing. Mary's drinking worsened in the 1940s and 1950s. She began receiving psychiatric care at the Austin Riggs Center, sometimes staying for months at a time. In 1952, she even underwent electroshock therapy. Rockwell, overwhelmed and lonely, turned to his work for comfort. He found emotional escape in the women he painted: quiet, idealized figures who reflected what he missed at home. In 1953, he moved with Mary to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, so she could be closer to her treatment center. Rockwell himself also began therapy again, trying to cope with the crushing pressure of fame and family struggles. In 1946, Rockwell released his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator. In it, he admitted that he often felt insecure and afraid of failing, even though millions saw him as the painter of America's happiness. He talked about the constant stress of deadlines and his relentless perfectionism. But he left out his darkest battles: his dependency on amphetamines to keep working and the anxiety and depression that haunted him daily. The book told a safe version of his life, not the full truth. By 1953, his son Peter had publicly accused him of being distant and obsessed with work, which created a family scandal. Yet letters discovered later showed that Norman had tried hard to be a loving father, helping his sons with money, giving advice, and even building a small studio for his eldest. But his perfectionism often consumed him. Some paintings took nearly a year to finish, and he even borrowed money from the bank just to survive while reworking a single cover. In 1959, Mary suddenly died of a heart attack. Rockwell was devastated. He poured his grief into his art, but the magazines that once adored him began rejecting his darker, emotional pieces. They only wanted the cheerful America he had always shown. His therapist, Eric Erickson, once told him, "You paint your happiness, but you don't live it." That truth hurt deeply. In 1961, Rockwell married again, this time to Molly Punderson, a retired teacher. He was 67, and she was 65. It wasn't a grand love story, but it brought him peace and order after years of chaos. He openly said he married her because she was organized and could help him manage his business affairs. The marriage lasted until his death and gave him the stability he had long needed. Then, in 1963, after nearly 5 decades, Rockwell left the Saturday Evening Post. His final cover was a portrait of President John F. Kennedy after the assassination. Over his career, he had painted 321 covers, but he felt the world had changed, and so had he. He was tired of painting perfect white families, and the magazine refused to let him show Black Americans in anything other than servant roles. Rockwell said, "I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. That kind of stuff is dead now." He joined Look magazine in 1964, finally free to paint what truly mattered to him: civil rights, truth, and injustice. But this freedom came with danger. He began receiving hateful letters and death threats. People called him a race traitor for painting black children and scenes of racial violence. Some threats were so severe that his life was at risk. Still, he refused to stop. That same year, he painted The Problem We All Live With, which showed 6-year-old Ruby Bridges walking to school, protected by U.S. Marshals, while racist slurs and a splattered tomato stained the wall behind her. The painting shocked the nation. Many readers were furious, and thousands cancelled their subscriptions. But Rockwell had finally painted the truth. He had found his voice. Through the 1960s, he worked to correct his past mistakes, reaching out to civil rights leaders, listening to activists, and making sure his new paintings showed Black Americans with dignity and respect. He didn't want to be a white savior, he wanted to tell honest stories. In 1964, after the murder of 3 young civil rights workers in Mississippi, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, Rockwell painted Murder in Mississippi, capturing their last moments surrounded by darkness. It took him 5 weeks to finish, and it left him emotionally drained, but he said it was the most meaningful work of his life. In 1967, he created New Kids in the Neighborhood, showing Black and white children meeting for the first time in a newly integrated community. The painting was simple and quiet but filled with hope. Rockwell was in his 70s, exhausted but still fighting for truth through art. In 1978, 7 of his paintings were stolen from a gallery in Minnesota, including one called Taking a Break. It became one of the biggest art thefts in the state's history. Decades later, in 2017, that painting was found inside a New Jersey home. Someone had unknowingly bought it for just a few dollars after it was damaged during a pool game. Years later, in 2013, a biographer claimed that Rockwell had hidden erotic drawings and struggled with repressed sexual desires, possibly toward men. She pointed to diary notes that hinted at deep affection for a young male assistant. Some experts believed it, while others, including his granddaughter, said the claims were unfair. The truth remains uncertain, but it showed how complex Rockwell really was behind his public image. On January 10, 1977, President Gerald Ford awarded Norman Rockwell the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor for an American civilian. Rockwell was too ill to attend, so his son accepted it on his behalf. He was 83 then, weak and reflective. Privately, he told people he sometimes felt like he had sold out earning fame and fortune but sacrificing artistic depth. He died on November 8, 1978, at the age of 84. After his death, people discovered he still owed about $50,000 in therapy bills, showing how much he had struggled with anxiety and depression throughout his life. The man who painted the happiest faces in America had carried invisible pain all along. In 2004, decades after his death, a remarkable discovery was made behind a false wall in another artist's home. It was the original painting Breaking Home Ties, one of Rockwell's most beloved works. The artist had hidden it and replaced it with a perfect copy during a bitter divorce. When the real one was finally sold at auction in 2006, it went for $15.4 million. Norman Rockwell's story was one of light and shadow. The world saw him as the painter of American happiness, but beneath the smiles, he battled loneliness, doubt, and regret. Through it all, his art reflected both what America was and what it could be: flawed but hopeful, divided but still dreaming.